Alright, so over the past year or so, I've been having a whole bunch of fun in Forza Horizon 4, specifically upgrading and tuning and racing cars. But I haven't seen much as in the way of guides for how to do these things. So I decided to make this guide on gear ratios. So I'm going to talk about what the gear ratios do, when they are more important and less important. I'm going to give you some recommended starting values and when you might want to change them. So in Forza, you usually have to have the race transmission upgrade on your car to change the gear ratios. Since I get this almost every time, I can't really tell you whether or not it is worth getting. In I'm guessing it's worth getting some of the time and probably not worth getting some of the time. All right, so let's say we have this example car. It's not super realistic, per se. It's got a wheel radius of 1.5 feet. I'm just trying to put out easy numbers for showing some calculations here. That means the wheel circumference is about 9.4 feet. The car weighs 2,000 pounds. It has 115 maximum horsepower, and the maximum speed is 110 miles per hour. Now, the maximum speed that you actually get when driving it is going to depend on your gear ratios. So when I say max speed here, I'm talking about a theoretical max speed if you gear it to maximize speed, like on flat ground. So that ends up being based on the drag or the air resistance, how much that slows you down compared to the horsepower of the car. So in Forza, when you're tuning, there's like a little sidebar. It'll tell you the max speed, which is like if you change the gear ratios, you can see that change. You either change the last gear that you have, or you change the final drive. Uh, so what I usually do to find out the max speed of a car is I just adjust the final drive gear ratio up and down and see where the max speed caps out at. All right, so for this example car, it has an engine. This is a very simple example. So it has this blue line here, that's your torque. It has exactly 100 foot-pounds of torque. And the green line here is your horsepower. You'll see this same chart in game when you're doing engine upgrades. Um, but the shape will be different. So usually the engine will start at some amount on the torque, and then it'll go up a bit and maybe come back down later. Sometimes it goes up a lot if you have a turbo or a twin turbo. It'll maybe look something like this. Uh, but for this easy example, it just has 100 foot-pounds of torque all the way up to 6,000 RPMs. If you don't know what horsepower is, it's just a calculation of the torque times the RPMs. And then it's divided by this certain magic number, uh, which is here where they cross, which is 5,252, if I recall correctly. Uh, Whatever that number is, it's not terribly important. But we'll see what the horsepower, why that is important later on. So for an easy example, let's say our car only has one gear, and here's our gear ratio is 2, and the final drive ratio, which is basically like another gear, is 4. So in game you'll have a chart like this, and normally you'll have more gears, so you'll have like more lines after your first one if you have more than one gear on your car. But in this case, we just have one gear. And this chart tells us a couple of useful things. One is that it goes up to 80 miles per hour, and the RPMs shows you the RPM range that your gear's in. So we'll see later on when you have a gear over here, let's say, for example, if it looked like that, then you'd know that second gear, you're going from 80 miles per hour to 100 miles per hour. And you're going in this RPMs of 4,000 to 6,000 RPMs in second gear. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, so let's stick to the one gear. So how does that gear make the car move? So your engine has, let's say I've picked a point here, which is 3,000 RPMs. So when your engine is spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute, the gear divides the speed to multiply the force. So the gear, after that first gear, that's spinning at 1,500 RPMs. And then the final drive divides the speed again, so that's 375 RPMs. That goes to the wheel, so when the wheel is spinning at 375 RPMs, then that means like the tire is rolling along the road at 3,534.3 feet per minute. That's based on the size of the wheel. And that comes out to 40 miles per hour. It's like 40 point something, but as you can see, I decided to make it as nice numbers as possible. So the force, on the other hand, we have 100 foot-pounds of torque. Torque is a rotational force. So the gear, since it divides the speed, that means it multiplies the force. So that's now 200 foot-pounds of torque after that first gear, and then 800 foot-pounds of torque after the final drive, which would go to the wheels. But through this whole process, there's a bunch of resistance that slows it down a bit. Well, it doesn't slow down the speed, but it takes away from some of the torque that makes it through. So I don't know what exactly that is in Forza. In this example here, I'm just saying that we're losing 25% of the torque between the engine and the wheels. So theoretically, that should be increased, or I should say, it should be more if you have an all-wheel drive car, and less if you're in a front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive. When I say more and less, I mean more loss and less lost. So, like, let's say if this was an all-wheel drive and it had 600 foot-pounds of torque, maybe it would be like 650 or something if it was a rear-wheel drive. But I don't know exactly how Forza does that. I assume they account for this somehow. But the exact amount isn't terribly important for all the explanations I'm going to be doing. So the wheel has 600 foot-pounds of torque. If you recall, it's a 1.5 foot radius wheel. So that means the force on the outside edge of the tire is 400 pounds. So as long as that is not more than the frictional force holding the tire to the road, then for your 2,000-pound car, that'll cause your car to accelerate at 0.2 G's of acceleration. But since gravity is 21.937 miles per hour per second, that's we can convert that to 4.4 miles per hour per second of acceleration, which is a kind of a more useful number in general. All right, so just having this one data point at 3,000 RPMs isn't terribly useful. But we can graph it. So instead of this being torque and RPMs, we have now converted that to miles per hour per second acceleration and miles per hour speed of the vehicle. So since our torque graph was flat, then this graph is also going to be flat. So all the way from 0 miles per hour to 80 miles per hour, we're accelerating at that 4.4 miles per hour per second. That's, of course, if there's no air resistance slowing you down. So if you're in a vacuum. We'll get to air resistance a little later. Now, if you have 2 gears, your graph in Forza is going to look something like this. And in this case, I've added another gear with a 4.0 gear ratio. Before we just had the 2.0 gear ratio. So even though we kind of added this gear second, it's actually going to be called first gear. So first gear takes us from 0 to 40 miles per hour. And then second gear, you could drive second gear all the way from 0 to 80 miles per hour still if you wanted to. But practically, we want to drive it from 40 miles per hour to 80 miles per hour. Because with the higher gear ratio, that means we're accelerating faster in this new first gear. So if we put that on our graph, then here's our new first gear, which we can see we're accelerating twice as fast as we are in second gear. Now let's jump up to 6 gears. So we have gear ratios 8, 4, 2.68, 2, 1.61, 1.34, and final drive ratio of 4. I picked these numbers to be kind of convenient in that they are every 20 miles per hour. So first gear goes to 20 miles per hour, second gear goes to 40 miles per hour, and so on and so on. All the way up to 120 miles per hour. So that will look like this. And you may be noticing that we have a curve going here. We'll talk about that in a second. But we're gonna add some things to this graph to have them for reference. So theoretically, Well, and in practice, you have a maximum possible acceleration based on how much friction is holding your driving tires to the road. So, if you have an all-wheel drive vehicle, then all four of your tires are driving tires, driving wheels. Then you have the whole weight of your car on your driving tires, and you have a high maximum acceleration amount. That's this dashed black line. Now, if you are on a rear wheel drive car, then only some of the weight of your car is over your driving tires, which means your driving tires total amount of friction holding them to the road is less. So you can't accelerate as fast on a rear wheel drive car. Now this is not just dependent on the weight of the car, but also the road condition and your tires, how good your tires are. So if you have really sticky tires, this will be higher. If you have bad tires, it'll be lower. If the weather is raining, then the black line will be lower also. Or if it's in the winter and the road is icy, then it'll be like really low. So, the exact value that this is at depends on so many things. And I haven't had much success trying to calculate exactly what it is in different scenarios in Forza. So I recommend you just testing, because basically if you have your first gear, if it's accelerating you faster than whatever that amount is, then your tires will lose traction and spin. They'll do like a burnout type of thing, where your car will move forward, but much slower than if you actually have traction. So in this case, for a rear wheel drive car, this first gear is too fast, so we're gonna want to bring it down below the black line at some point. But let's add a couple other things to this picture. So the maximum possible acceleration at a given speed is that curved line I was talking about earlier. Now this is not lining up in all cases with the maximum RPMs for each gear. What it's actually lining up with is the point of maximum horsepower. So we'll see later an example where the maximum horsepower is not at the maximum RPMs. So yeah. So no matter how we gear the car, your acceleration will never be above and to the right of this dashed gray line. So say if we had a gear ratio here, it would only go to here. If we had one in here, it would only go to here. It can never go to the right of that. So when we're doing our gear ratios, what we are largely trying to do is to maximize our overall acceleration, which means we're trying to minimize the gaps between our gears and that dashed gray line. So we're missing out on some possible acceleration here. We're missing out on some here. Missing out on some here. And of course, we can only go up to the black line here, so we're missing out here. So we can't gear the car to get rid of all of those gaps, but what we can do, well, unless you have infinite gears, you could do that. But since we don't, what we're trying to do is overall minimize those gaps, especially where acceleration is most important to us, which can vary in different situations. All right, so your maximum possible speed is going to be based on this new line here that I've added, the red line, which is from the air resistance, also called drag. So that is proportional to your speed squared, so it kind of curves upwards like this. So your maximum possible speed is where it meets the dashed gray line, right here. But in this case, what we have is 6th gear, which is this bottom blue line. It runs into the red line right about here at about 104 or 105 miles per hour. So the way the car is currently geared, it won't be able to go past 104 or 105 miles per hour on a flat road. So we want to probably increase 6th gear if we want to maximize, if we want to be able to go to that max speed of 110 miles per hour. We got to bring it up a little bit. So since everything was getting a little bit cluttered, I got rid of all the extra lines here from the RPMs for each gear that we don't plan on using. So they're still there, but just to get rid of some of the clutter, I removed them from this graph just to make things a little bit easier to see. So let's say our car was rear-wheel drive, then since the black line was below what we had before, which was a 1st gear way up here somewhere, we needed to move 1st gear down so that it would be under the black line. And then we also wanted to bring 6th gear up to get to our max speed of 110 miles per hour, like I was talking about just a minute ago. So what I decided to do was I made 1st gear in this example go to exactly 30 miles per hour. That's right here. And then I evenly spaced out the rest of the gears. So they come out to, I think it was like 16 miles per hour each. All the way up to for the 2nd gear, all the way up to 6th gear. So that's an improvement on what we had before. So this is what the gear ratios were before, and this is what they were after. So a lot of the times you generally want this shape on your well, I'd say like 90% of the time, maybe more. You want this general shape on your gear chart thing in Forza, where you have kind of this curve along the bottom of each gear, where you're slowly narrowing down the RPM range that each gear uses. Now you can gear it differently if you want. So So you might see some. Trying to bring up the pen again. All right, so you might see sometimes where a gear and gears after all start at the same RPMs. That's sometimes also a decent maneuver. And occasionally you'll see one where the last gear actually goes below the ones before it. But in general, I would not recommend that. I recommend just doing like this. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the power band, which you may have heard of before. So depending on the shape of your torque curve, your horsepower curve changes. Although it always starts at 0 and it goes up as the RPMs increase. And usually it'll be at the top at the end of the RPMs or very near it. We'll see some different situations. But in this case, what the power band is the area of high RPMs of the engine, which is, the area of high horsepower for the engine, which is the RPM range that you want to be, what you want to be in for all your gears after first gear. So we'll see why the high horsepower thing is important in a minute. I don't think there's an exact definition if it's got to be like 80% of your max horsepower is where your power band is or anything like that. And I don't know if there's an exact definition of like what's a wide power band and what's a narrow power band. But I'm just going to call this a medium power band if your torque is flat. And you can see here that we've got maybe 1,000 RPMs are looking pretty good as far as not losing too much horsepower. But the farther you go out, the more of a horsepower drop there is. So if that's a medium power band, then when your torque is increasing, your horsepower curves upward. It might be kind of hard to see in the picture, but it is actually curving upward here. So that means that your area, your power band, your area where the horsepower is high, is smaller than it was before. So we'll call that a narrow power band. Now, if your torque is going down a little bit, then you have this wide power band. Now, keep in mind, all these engines that I've shown you, they're all 115 maximum horsepower. But this is a wide power band. This line should be curved a little bit. I'm not sure entirely. I think it curves upwards, but I could be wrong. But I didn't want to go through the hassle of actually making that curved. But anyways, the important part is we got a wide power band in this situation. And I don't know if this is even a technical car term because I'm just a video game guy, not a car guy. But I'm going to call this a power hill, where your peak horsepower here, still 115 horsepower, is not at your maximum RPMs. So you still have a power band. It's just not where it usually is. And we'll see in a minute why this is important for gearing. Very important for gearing. Alright, so we'll bring it to this chart here. We're using the same gear ratios we had before, like after we changed them. So first gear goes to 30 miles per hour, and the rest of them are all evenly spaced out. So with the flat torque, we've seen this before. If we're only driving in the optimal gear, then it's just flat like this. And as I showed you before, we got this sort of triangular shape here of acceleration that we are missing out on. So that's with our medium power band. With the narrow power band, our torque is increasing for each gear. If we're only in the proper gear each time, then we have this area here for each gear. That is the acceleration that we are missing out on. So we go back to here, we got this triangle, we go to here. With our narrow power band, we see that we are missing more acceleration. So even though the car has the same horsepower, on average, it accelerates slower. Now, if we have a wide power band, we have it where we had it where the torque was flat and then it goes down a little bit. Then it looks like this, and we can see that we have a much smaller area of acceleration that we're missing out on. So that's very good for us if we're trying to go as fast as possible. In this case, we also go above the black line here. I will address in our next example how we want to actually change that. But the main thing you should be concerned with is that the wide power band gives us more acceleration than the narrow power band, the medium power band. That's good stuff. Now, with the power hill, that's the one where the peak horsepower, let me go back to it real quick. Peak horsepower is somewhere in the middle of the chart. In this case, we see that it lines up right here where the torque goes from flat to going down. So, yeah, this. So, on our chart, these intersect the gray line here at that point of peak horsepower, like I was telling you about before. But another thing that you need to be looking at is we have the lines from the gears crossing, which we have not seen until now. Now, what that means is, for example, if you're driving along in first gear, at whatever RPMs this is in first gear, you should shift to second gear. Because if you stay in first gear, then you're actually accelerating slower at this part, and then if you wait till 30 miles per hour here to shift gears to second gear, then second gear at the start will actually be faster than first gear. So you have to shift sooner, which is pain to keep track of because the RPMs where that is changes depending on how you gear it. The other thing we have here is since the point where it connects with the gray line is not at the maximum RPMs, then everything kind of looks like it's moved over. That's because our new max speed here, 6th gear goes from here about 70 miles per hour all the way to 105 miles per hour, and we're not getting to our max speed of 110 miles per hour. So we've got to fix some things here. So oh yeah, so at the point where these connect, say first gear meets second gear, what that means is the horsepower at the RPMs. Actually, let me erase this. All right, let me talk about this point here. So say if you were in first gear all the way to 30 miles per hour, that's the 6,000 RPMs. That's your max RPMs. Now, if the next gear is above that, what that means here is, here's your first gear. Your first gear horsepower ends here. If you draw a line across, that means that your next gear's horsepower starts somewhere up here. And that's how you know if you're going to have the crossing lines thing that we got going on. So what we could do is we could change it so that second gear starts here. And that's where we that would lower the gear ratio of second gear, which would bring second gear down like this, basically about where the purple one is right now, third gear. Or let me erase. Or what we could do is we end first gear earlier. Give me the pen. Or we end first gear earlier at whatever RPMs lines up with the horsepower the second gear starts at. So second gear starts here on the RPMs, and first gear ends here, and that would be a way to line them up properly. So what I did here in this case was I had first gear and at whatever this RPMs was, and I did the same for the rest of these. So now we're in the optimal gear for each. We haven't changed the gear ratios yet, but what you can see is, like I mentioned earlier, 6th gear is like super long and way out there. And first gear, since we went above the black line, we need to bring that back down. So here's some improvements on that. What I did in this case was I brought first gear down, lowered the gear ratio to bring it under the black line, and I had it stop at the same miles per hour that it did before, which was 30 miles per hour. And then I redid the gear ratios of all the rest of these to spread them out to the same miles per hour that they had before. Technically, sixth gear, since it's only on the line at the corner there, it's below the line here, so we're technically hitting the air resistance red line slightly sooner. But since it's so close to the line, it's not really important here. Now I could have done this a little differently for second gear. Was I could have had this higher. Something more like this. And then the line would have been slightly to the left. So that would slow us down. It would slow us down a little bit here, but it would speed us up a little bit here. But in this case, what I would recommend doing instead, erase all. What I would recommend doing instead is actually to stay in first gear longer. You'd want to stay in first gear longer and potentially move second gear down a little bit to something like this. So first gear goes something like that, and then second gear would then be a little bit more to the right. So it would make the gap here a little bit smaller, and the gap up here would be almost nothing. But if you do that, then of course second gear is shorter. When I say shorter, I'm talking about it covers less miles per hour. Whoops. Give me the pen. So if it covers less miles per hour, then it's shorter in terms of time it takes you to get through the gear. So because it takes time to shift gears, you don't want any gear to be too short. So if you were to extend first gear out, like I was talking about, then you would probably want to compress all the rest of these to the right just a little bit. Alright, so here's the new gear ratios from that previous slide. And this is the RPMs on the right that they're actually using in the mile per hour that we're actually driving it at. Now the Forza, the game graph, the graph for these in the Forza game, it'll still draw them, the lines, all the way out to 6,000 miles per hour. So first gear will go all the way out to there. Second gear, it won't show this part. It'll just draw it out to there. Third gear, whoops. Well, hopefully you get the idea, but it won't show the parts that are covered by the RPMs going out to 6,000 miles per hour here. The third gear go out to there. And fourth gear, none of that'll show. It'll go out to here. So you have to do all these calculations yourself if you have this power hill this power hill horsepower graph thing. So I it's just a lot of work, so I try to usually avoid it. So to summarize the power band, a wide power band keeps you closer to the maximum possible acceleration at each speed. So on average, you're accelerating faster. A narrow power band means your car is essentially less efficient. And if you add gears, you can minimize that problem. Otherwise, you need more horsepower on your car basically to compensate for that. I guess I don't think I showed adding gears before, so let's say here, if instead of a six gear car, if it was a 10 gear car, then we could add a gear here. A gear would be about here. Another one would be about here. So that stuff would go away. This would go away. So we would have a triangle there and a triangle there for what we're missing out on, instead of missing out on this whole big triangle. Back to where, all right. And then for the power hill, like we saw, you gotta gear and drive the vehicle so that your RPMs stay near the top of the power hill. Or you could just say in the power band. But like I said, it's a pain to keep track of. So say for example, for RPMs, I don't keep track of the RPMs that I need to change gears at. If I have a car with a power hill thing, what I keep track of is what miles per hour you're going at to switch gears. So in this case, we know we're still switching gears at 30 miles per hour, at 46 miles per hour, at 62 miles per hour. Keep track of that instead of trying to keep track of, oh, this gear, you need to switch gears at 4,600 RPMs and this gear at 4,400 RPMs. Okay. Now, on to my recommendations of how to gear. So, step one, decide how many gears to use. Usually you want to use all your gears. Most cars in Forza, you'll have 6 gears. Some of the hypercars might have 7 or even more. The most I think I've seen is 10. But yeah, in general, you want to use all of them just to minimize the amount of acceleration that you're missing out on. If you feel like your gears are too fast, so you feel kind of like you should use less, then here's some things to consider. One is having what I call a throwaway first gear. What that is a gear that you use only at the start of the race, and then you never come back to it. I'll go into more of an example of this a little bit later. For compressed high gears, if you feel like you have extra gears, shove them in the high miles per hour range, because that is where the time for each gear increases. So the gear shift time becomes less of a factor. All right, so step 2, after you've figured out how many gears you're using, decide how fast you want first gear. So you have to ask yourself, is it worth maximizing acceleration in first gear? Uh, so if you're just drag racing, probably yes. Uh, Otherwise, maybe not. So what you always have to keep in mind is wherever you're maximizing your acceleration, that means you're speeding up at a certain part, but you're slowing yourself down somewhere else. So if you're in first gear a lot, then yes, you probably want to accelerate. You probably want to maximize acceleration in first gear. But if you're not in first gear very often, and you're going, if you're spending most of your time at like 100 miles per hour, and first gear goes up to 20 miles per hour, then it doesn't really make sense to maximize your acceleration in first gear. You can slow first gear down so that you can maximize your acceleration somewhere else. Another thing to consider, do you want first gear to be able to handle suboptimal conditions? So say if you maximize first gear for a nice dry road, and then you get in a race and it happens to be raining, then since you were at the maximum acceleration for a dry road, it'll be too much for the wet road, and then that means the rain will slow you down. Now, if you don't maximize the first gear acceleration, then you can bring it so much down. You can either gear it so that you don't slip at all in on a wet road, or you could gear it so you just slip less on a wet road, I guess you could say. Now, slipping less doesn't help you per se, but what it means is, say if you're in first gear, if you're in first gear and it goes to say 30 miles per hour, but you're slipping when it's raining, then that means for those 30 miles per hour, you have to go lighter on the throttle so that you're not your tires aren't slipping. But if you had the lower gear ratio instead, if you had it like this, for example, then maybe you're still slipping in first gear, but to slow down for the rain, you're losing less acceleration here than the whole thing, and you're going out farther here in first gear, which means you are you're not missing out on as much acceleration in your later gears. So hopefully that explanation made sense. And then the last thing that's pretty important is when you slow down for a sharp turn, do you want to come out in first gear or in second gear? So if you come out, if you're coming out of a sharp turn in second gear, that's what we call the throwaway first gear. But say So say here's like 40 miles per hour, let's say. Say if that's how slow you have to take a sharp turn, then if your first gear goes to 40 miles per hour and your second gear goes from 40 miles per hour to something else, then you would go to second gear for all those sharp turns, and then you get the whole second gear to accelerate in. So there's a couple other ways you can do this. You can have first gear lower so that you're downshifting into first gear for those sharp turns, which means second gear gets to be farther out here and you're more efficient in your acceleration for your higher speeds. Or you have it like we were talking about before, where first gear ends at 40 miles per hour and you start here, second gear. Of course, you could also have first gear go even shorter, and then you'd bring second gear up. So second gear would start at maybe 35 miles per hour or something. But then it wouldn't go as far. So it's things to consider. Usually for a sharp turn, you do want to end up in first gear. So you'll want to send, in this example, you'd want first gear to go to like 60 miles per hour or something, depending on exactly how fast the acceleration is. You don't want to go into first gear and then only be in first gear for like half a second before you have to shift up to second gear. That's the type of situation that you're trying to avoid. So, once you've decided how fast you want to have first gear, you can pick some gear ratios out. So, the gear number will be here on the left. Only use as many as you have gears. So, since I've seen 10 gear cars in Forza, I made this table go all the way to 10 rows. Now, these ones in yellow are the ones I use the most. So 6 gears. So this one is pretty fast acceleration for doing like a quick start at low speeds. This one is maybe a bit more well-rounded, you could say. But those are the ones that I use the most. So as you go to the left on this graph, it's a shorter first gear. And as you go to the right, it's a longer first gear. So this first column, first gear is the same amount of miles per hour as second gear, as third gear, and however many gears you have. And at the far right column here, first gear is 5 times as wide as each of the other gears. So they're all spread out, so every gear after first gear is the exact same miles per hour increment. So the difference is just that first gear, as you go to the right on the chart, first gear becomes wider and wider. Now, as you add gears here, say, let's keep it real simple. If you have a first gear and a second gear, then here's your max miles per hour here. You're going to end up setting your max miles per hour to the end of second gear. But as soon as you add a third gear, then you're going to adjust your final drive ratio after that so that this is your max miles per hour. But when you do that, you'll see in Forza that will kind of scrunch your chart. So it'll look more like this. So by adding a gear, it decreases the relative to your max speed, how long first gear is. So if you have fewer gears, you're going to want to stick to the left side of the chart. For example, if you have only 3 gears, this first block right here, that'll have first gear and second gear and third gear all be the exact same number of miles per hour. Whereas this column here, first gear is twice as big as second and third gear if you were to use this for a 3-gear car. So that's generally not what you'd want. So the fewer gears you have, stick to the left side of the chart. If you have more than 6 gears, you'll want to go more to the right side of the chart. It's possible that, well, we'll look at it this way. If you have 6 gears, you choose this one on the right side of the chart. That means half of your max speed is in first gear. So if you have a 200 miles per hour max speed car, then you're going 0 to 100 in first gear. If you have a rear wheel drive car, it is possible that I'm talking about a rear wheel drive car with really high horsepower, then it's possible that your tires will spin even in that situation. But to bring back the pin. But in general, I recommend you not go with that high of horsepower in a rear wheel drive car. You should consider upgrades, changing your upgrades around so that you are not getting as much horsepower, or you should change it so it's an all-wheel drive car. Or you need to do tire upgrades if you can so that you have better traction with the road. Alright, so after you've selected your starting gear ratios, you want to set your final drive. Like I was saying earlier, it'll you just where's my pen? Can't see my mouse cursor on the screen. Oh well. So I'll draw it on this screen. So you'll have your chart thing, and you just adjust it basically so that your last gear ends in the top right corner of the chart. And that'll be roughly correct. Or like I was talking about earlier, what I usually do is I just watch the little simulation max speed thing. So you'll either scrunch it or expand it to set your final drive ratio. But you want to consider how fast are you actually going to go. So if you're running it on a really small course like the Horizon Festival circuit, I think they call it, you'll never hit max speed unless you're on like a super low top speed car, basically. So if you're trying to make a car that's really good on the Horizon Festival circuit, for example, you might set the final drive so that your max speed is only like half as much as your actual max speed. Depending on your car, of course. Maybe half's a exaggeration. Maybe more like 80% of your max speed. But it all depends on, supposed to be a percent. But it all depends on your car and what track you're actually going on. So if you want like a good all around car, you generally want to set it to whatever the actual max speed is. If you or slightly under, slightly like 95% or something. When you're talking about cars that go like 260 miles per hour, you're on any of the in-game tracks, most of the time you're not gonna get there. Now keep in mind you can go actually above the max speed if you're going downhill, but if your car's max speed is high, it takes a while to like get close to that. So unless you're going like downhill on the freeway, you're just running up and down the freeway, there's a good chance you're never going to exceed that max speed. But if you do want to have that potential, like say you're doing like a B class car or something, that will actually happen a little more often. So you'll want to go like 5 to 10 miles per hour. You'll want to gear for like 5 to 10 miles per hour above max speed. You'll have to calculate yourself exactly how much that is, because the game will still tell you max speed of whatever. It's not going to go above what the it won't like do a downhill simulation for you or whatever. So you'll have to try to estimate that yourself. But basically, you'll just decrease your final drive ratio a little bit if you want to be able to go above max speed going downhill. All right. So, after you have set all your gears up and you've set the final drive ratio, you want to test first gear. I recommend you start a race to do this and hold down the throttle, see if the tires burn out. Now the Horizon Festival drag strip's a good place to do this. I don't know exactly what they do, but starting a race and holding down the throttle is how I get the best results. If I try to actually like hold down the clutch and get some RPMs going and release the clutch and drive it like I was actually driving a car from a standstill, I tend to not get as good of results as starting a race. So I recommend starting a race to test it. Now, so if the tires burn out, that means they're spinning. You should be able to hear it. If you're on the controller, you'll have a little bit of vibration. If you look at the telemetry, you'll see on the friction for your tires, a couple of your tires are going crazy. Then that means you need to pick a slower first gear. So, a reminder, slower is you pick a set of gear ratios somewhere to the right of whatever you picked before. And then once you do that, the whatever your last gear ratio is going to be different unless you have a 5-gear car. But otherwise, the last ratio is going to be different, so you're going to have to change the the final drive ratio a bit, and then you'll test first gear again with that new set of ratios and see if that's good. So once again, you don't want the tires to spin if they're, or you don't want them to slip. You don't want them to lose traction. Let me put it that way. Now, step 6 is going to be adjusting the middle gears. Now, most of the time, I do not adjust the middle gears. Say that again. Most of the time, I do not adjust the middle gears. Now, I'm not sure how much is... Whoops. Bring up the pen again. Go. So, I'm not sure if these ratios are just super amazing, or maybe they're just super amazing of how I like to drive. But I drive all-wheel drive cars most of the time. So I do, this is my go-to. I use this, I've used this for rear-wheel drive. And I've also used it for one of my S2 class all-wheel drive cars. It's because it just has way too much horsepower for the tires. It goes up to 260 miles per hour, so it needs a slower first gear. But unless you're driving those ridiculously fast cars, this is my go-to for all-wheel drive cars, and it works out great. A lot of the times I drive more on the handling side than on the high top speed side. So I usually go for a faster first gear and faster earlier gears so that I get up to my car's max speed faster. But there's a different way of looking at it. Is if you have a slower first gear, then your later gears are faster. So if you have a car that's high handling, like the ones I'm talking about, then having more efficient acceleration at your higher speeds is better, because you don't have to slow down as much as other cars for the turns. So that's a reason you might want to consider going to the right. But that's what we're going to talk about here for adjusting middle gears. If you do want to adjust middle gears, you got to ask yourself, when is maximizing acceleration most important? It's a drag race. You definitely want to be fast accelerating at the start of the race. Otherwise, it's kind of up to you. But I do like my my ratios as far as just having a good all-around one. Like I said, most of the time I do not adjust the middle gears whatsoever. So, but if you want to possibly change them, like I said, you want to see what speeds are you spending the most time in. So if you're not slowing down below like half your max speed very often, then you want to be as efficient as possible in your acceleration for the speeds above that half max speed. And always consider, if you like I was saying earlier, if you're speeding yourself up somewhere, that means you're slowing yourself down somewhere else. So whenever you decrease a gear ratio, it makes that gear longer and the next gear shorter. Or whenever you increase a gear ratio, it makes that gear shorter and the next gear longer. So you have two gears that are going out like this. If you decrease a gear ratio, then this one will become something like that. So that's longer, but then you're no longer using this RPMs for that gear, so that gear's shorter. If you have two gears here, you make this right here. All right. If you have here and you want to make this one, you want to increase the gear ratio here, that one's shorter, but now that means you have to be earlier here in the next gear, so that gear becomes longer. Now let's go for an example. So say you have a 6-gear car, max speed of 110 miles per hour, and we'll say it's rear wheel drive, just so the graph looks like all the other ones I've shown so far. Let's say you pick starting ratios of 2.5, 1.82, 1.43, 1.18, 1.0, and 0.87. That's the second highlighted group that I was talking about earlier. For final drive, you just adjust it to the max speed. We're not trying to go faster downhill. We're not trying to have a earlier max speed to race on like smaller tracks or anything. We're just making a nice all-purpose car here. Then that's what our gear ratios look like. So on the my chart thing, I don't know if this kind of chart has a name or something, but it'll look like this on your chart. And let's say, for example, that you find yourself most of the time you're above 60 miles per hour. Then, like say for example, you're running a lot of courses that are they don't have very sharp turns. So most of your time you're on the higher speeds here, and that means that your acceleration going up to 60 miles per hour is not as important as your acceleration past 60 miles per hour. So what we're going to do here is we're going to bring second gear down to go to 60 miles per hour so that we can compress the remaining gears here. So that means fourth gear will come down kind of a lot. I didn't draw that very well, but it's going to be kind of a lot. And then the rest of these are going to go down like slightly. Except the last gear, we will not change the last gear ratio at all, but it will be a little bit shorter because we brought fifth gear down a little. So we're not using a little bit of RPMs there. So that's after what it would look like on this chart. Or if we come back to the charts here, we see we didn't change first gear. Second gear went from 1.82 to 1.6. Third gear went 1.43 to 1.32, and so on. Like I said, don't change sixth gear. As you can see, these second gear, whoop, that was a terrible circling job. But second gear changed a lot more than the gears after it. Second gear changed a lot, and then slowly less and less change until no change. And then final drive didn't change either. So that means our graph, instead of having the nice curve like usual, we have a bigger second gear here. And then these are all a little bit smaller. And that's it. So hopefully that was all helpful for how to deal with gear ratios in Forza. I originally was doing this back in Forza Motorsport 5. I never like made a guide for it or anything, but I've done a lot of looking into how it's supposed to work, so I figured I'd make this guide for YouTube, and hopefully you all enjoyed it. And yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to make guides for other stuff in Forza, but I think I'll record some races and stuff because I do have a lot of fun.